So again, we're going to shift the topic a little bit to sheltering. For those people who can evacuate, to try to get into a safe environment and the relative high ground of Florida, relatively speaking, of course. So we have three speakers. We're going to follow the same similar format, at least for about 10 minutes to speak about whatever topic. And that should give ample time for questions and still keep us on time for our coffee break. So first I'd like to invite Zane Smith from AARP to speak, and I don't think you have a PowerPoint, correctly? Do it the old-fashioned way. Okay.
Yeah, I like old school. So I'm Zane Smith. I'm an Associate State Director for Advocacy at AARP, which that technically means I'm a lawyer/lobbyist. So I do not come from the PhD realm. I'm coming from the legal and advocacy realm. And so speaking of sheltering, one of the things AARP has taken a particular interest in and really focuses on are the nursing homes, and then also the estimated about 2.6 million people here in Florida who are at home who can't evacuate because of health conditions that are typically seniors or disabled. And so with that being said, I'm going to give a brief history of where we've been legislatively in the state of Florida and how we've sought to address this as a state and to our current happenings that are happening in Tallahassee literally as we speak. So we saw back in 1992 after Hurricane Andrew, that was the first real push here in Florida to create some sort of centralized meaning or way as a state that we address hurricane recovery and disaster issues. There were some laws passed. That's where we first got the requirement that hospitals, gas stations, and grocery stores have a backup generator for power sources. At the same time, that is when typically residents started to build homes with hurricane latch roofs or reinforced walls, hurricane windows, installing shutters or getting them prefabricated. Then we had the hurricane season that in 2005, that was Wilma and her gang of other hurricanes that hit that year. So in 2006, that was the first time the Florida legislature really took a look at and made a legitimate attempt to pass laws that would require nursing homes to have generators. That attempt failed due to politics, and so now we come to our current situation in Florida post-Irma, where we unfortunately did have here in Hollywood, Florida, the nursing home deaths that were associated with high heat temperatures. And what we're seeing now is kind of a threefold approach of how the state of Florida is trying to address these sheltering needs for these people who are unable to physically evacuate. So we're seeing three different ways. First is the executive level. Days after the hurricane hit and we started hearing these stories coming out of Hollywood, Florida nursing home, the governor issued an emergency declaration that required that nursing homes and assisted living facilities across Florida install within 60 days backup generators that would allow for 96 hours minimum of cooling at 81 degrees. And so days after the governor's declaration, we saw the industry, the nursing home industry and the ALF industry throw together a summit in Tallahassee, which was well attended by not only the nursing home and ALF industry, but also the utility industry, the caregiver industry, and it was pretty much across the board acknowledged that we need to do something. However, what the governor is requiring of us is just not possible within a 60-day realm. So we have the executive level, we've got the governors, and now it's been through some court battles, and currently where we stand is the Agency on Healthcare Administration and the Department of Elder Affairs here in Florida have backed up the governor's rules, and they started the formal rulemaking process, which would then codify the governor's declaration. So that's executive. We also have currently a legislative attempt to address this and put into Florida statutes rules and laws related to nursing homes. Right now, there's a 21-member panel in the Florida House that is reviewing and investigating from everything from fuel reserves to nursing home generators to the electrical power grid to traffic, evacuations, everything the last panel just talked about. They've been going over this for the past 8 weeks right now and taking public testimony from various entities throughout Florida and from around the United States to really, how do we get some legislation flowing for the 2018 legislative session that will make something stick and help Florida for future hurricane needs. So we've got this 21-member panel. We also have Senate bills that have been filed. Currently, there's about 11, to give you an idea, 11 various bills that are omnibus bills that address everything from the top down to very specific, maybe related to power restoration or to how to finance these generators in the nursing homes. So we've got a legislative push right now. We also have a judicial push. We've seen where the courts have now become involved, and it's through various methods, and not to get too into the details because it's not something AARP covers in the legal sense, but there are multiple lawsuits that are currently filed that are gaining ground that relate to FP&L's potential culpability and the lack of electrical service and the prioritization of getting it back online for nursing homes. We have lawsuits related to the nursing home itself and culpability around the deaths, and it was just actually this week labeled as 12 of the 14 deaths as homicides, so there might be criminal negligence or criminal culpability in that. And we've got the Florida Supreme Court also evaluating the governor's proposal right now. So all three branches of Florida government is really attempting to take a hard look at this and really see what we can do as a state to do better. I'll just briefly go over a few numbers that you might find interesting. Here in Florida, there are 683 nursing homes, and that accounts for about 73,000 people currently who are in these nursing homes. In terms of assisted living facilities, there are 3,089 assisted living facilities that allows for about 92,000 beds. So if you take those two numbers together, that's about 165,000 people that most likely physically cannot evacuate. Now, nursing homes and ALFs are required to have emergency evacuation plans in place prior to any kind of hurricane season. But as we saw, some of those might have failed, some of those might have been duplicated from the years prior and fell short of the proper safety protocols. We did, however, see a lot of nursing homes and ALFs across the board, and in my own home area in the Tampa Bay area, do a good job. They did evacuate. They had reciprocity with higher ground facilities or emergency need shelters. So I don't want to make it seem like they all were bad in this, but we do have a few that really, I think, highlighted the need for better protocols statewide. And to give you an idea for the emergency generator idea that's been floated around here heavily, and that will most likely be a large part of the 2018 legislative discussion related to hurricane preparedness, the dollar figure is $230 million for all the nursing homes in Florida to comply with the governor's declaration. And if you break it down, that's about $350,000 per facility that's 120 beds or more. So I'll close with that and happy to answer any questions afterward.
Thank you. So next I'd like to invite Lauree Simmons from the Big Dog Ranch Rescue.
Hi, I'm Lauree Simmons. Oh, is this on? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I'm right next to you though. Can you hear in the back?
Is that better? I'm Lauree Simmons. I'm the president and founder of Big Dog Ranch Rescue. We are now the largest no-kill dog rescue in the country, just 3/4 of the way complete, building our new cage-free 33-acre facility in Palm Beach County. So I actually have not been that involved in hurricanes as far as evacuating or helping other than on a small scale with our rescue in the past, but this year was a really, really big year for us. We got urgent phone calls from Beaumont, Texas, and dispatched 2 vans to try to get to a shelter before it flooded. Our team ended up getting surrounded by water in Texas and learned quite a few lessons out there of what not to do when you're trying to go evacuate animals. They were stuck there for a day and a half, but then we're eventually able to get through and bring back about 70 animals from Texas and deliver about 10,000 pounds of food. Right after that, all of you know that Irma hit, and we went into preparation mode at Big Dog to receive what we thought would be just maybe 10 or 12 animals that would show up where people said, I have nowhere for my dog. We had over 120 in a 24-hour period right before the storm hit. Basically, every animal shelter that was full, boarding facilities were full. People just had nowhere to take their animals and wanted to surrender them. We gave them the alternative to leave their animal with us and come back within a week and get their animal, and probably, I would say 80% of them did. After Irma hit, I think one of the biggest shortfalls in Florida was getting roads open for supplies to get in down in the Keys. We were getting urgent calls from the shelters, animal rescues, and from people that we had adopted dogs to that did stay behind or had nowhere to take 70 cats and 60 dogs or whatever they had in their facility. They had no way to get any supplies down there. They had no power, and the National Guard had stopped all traffic at the upper end of the Keys, so there was no stores to buy any food for animals. There was nothing open. There was no way to get any down there. What we found most helpful is rallying all of the rescues together. So 10 of us rescues, Furry Friends, Tri-County, Peggy Adams, all of us started collecting. We all put out urgent pleas for food, for dog food, cat food, animal food, and we found some grass strips down in the Keys, and we flew it in. Every day we flew in plane loads of food to the upper Keys, the middle Keys, to get them by, because it was 12 days before anybody, the National Guard would let anybody down there. So one thing that I think falls short in hurricanes and preparedness is the shelters. We should make it mandatory. Only 50% of the shelters, human shelters, allow animals to come in. And I think it should be mandatory that everybody can bring their animal and there is a place for the animals to be. Because when they're left behind, and trust me, I broke all rules. I got a phone call about 3 dogs tied out in the middle of the hurricane 3 miles from our facility, and I drove in that, and I got those animals, and the terrified looks on their faces and we only got not even close to what the Keys got down there, but, and the people, you know, when we contacted them afterwards, the people told us we had no choice. None of the shelters that we could go to would take the animals. The hotels wouldn't take the animals. We didn't know where to go. We thought they would be safe tied out. So preparedness for the animals and letting people know where they can safely take their pet is a big downfall, I think, in the state of Florida. And, you know, even worse in the other states. So I think, you know, legislation needs to happen just like it does with nursing homes, but also to protect the animals and to be better prepared to have supplies there for them, for the ones that stay behind. We dodged a bullet here this time compared to what I've seen in Puerto Rico, and we have taken 30,000 pounds of food flown over to different areas of Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands and safely brought home 700 animals that people got on planes. The airlines wouldn't let them take their animals and left behind and brought them back to rescues throughout the United States. So I'm here and an advocate to try to change laws to prepare for safety of all the animals left behind.
Great, thank you. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Huber from Florida Atlantic University.
I appreciate that. I just got an upgrade to doctor. I'm not a doctor, but I am an architect, and I also teach at Florida Atlantic University School of Architecture. I do have a presentation, I think, that's going to be loaded up here, but one of the things I just wanted to start out with is I'm one of the rare Florida natives. How many of you in here are Florida natives, born and raised? All right, there's a pretty good handful of you. August 24th, 1992, you probably know that day. It's a day that lives in infamy for most of us. I grew up in a little town called Homestead, just south of here. And I got to live through a little storm there. And the thing that I want to talk about today is not necessarily sheltering through the storm. I think we've solved that. And Hurricane Andrew, the codes and the modifications that happened to the codes have changed that radically. I mean, many of us didn't have a single problem with our building structures and so on and so forth during Irma. And I think this is, do you have it? Okay. But I guess the issue, as we're getting this up, is I think our survivability during the storms has actually obviously increased. I mean, our buildings are pretty resilient during the storm. The problem is it's after. It's the recovery, and it's that relief effort and the recovery efforts that's become the bigger issue. And so in August 24th, 1992, it was a month and a half afterwards that I finally received the power. And living in a 35-foot travel trailer on the side of my house for a year and a half, waiting for my house to be rebuilt was another fun and exciting experience. And if we can go to the first slide. Sorry, that's the second slide. It's weird. Okay, there we go. So what I just wanted to talk about is the relief from the heat may not be where you think. And so I wrote a letter and an op-ed into the Sun Sentinel, if you go to that next slide now. But the main thesis behind this, I think, is that we all too often have sat there and we think about and we want to curse the power company for its lack and its inability to get power back on. But what we really need to question is how are we designing our contemporary buildings? I think the key issue is that the building code finally in the 5th edition did make some modifications for energy efficiency, but I don't think they're there yet. I think we live in a mechanically augmented reality here in South Florida. And we, for the last 50 years, have thrown out what our grandparents knew, common sense. So I'm not about to give big data here or imparting data. What I want to do is impart common sense today. And so the next slide is just looking at the vernacular traditions of architecture in our communities. And this is the thing that all too often, and I'm a little worried about, is the bulldozer bait that we're currently seeing from the 1950s and architecture before that. But these are prime examples. These are where we can learn lessons of how to adapt and survive and be resilient in our communities here. This is where we see vernacular architectural traditions, and those have not been recovered in my parents' generation or even in my generation. And so the schools of architecture are finally trying to bring that back, I think, into our students' mindsets, especially at Florida Atlantic University, and thinking about subtropical architecture. How do you deal with hot, humid climates? And so this is just a whole collection. Obviously, we know there's about 5 tenets. And if you go to the next slide, I won't go into too much of those images, but there's 5 tenets. It's pretty common sense practice about what we need to do in order to make our architecture more resilient. And so what I guess I'm advocating for is somehow either we need to build this into our codes, or we need to just ask for design sensibility and design common sense to come back into our architecture. And so, sorry, go back. One of those, the first one is just passive ventilation strategies. How many of you know how to produce passive ventilation? You're just designing for it. I mean, it's pretty common sense practices that our grandparents knew, but we've forgotten this, and I'll get into it in a second. But the second thing is just large openings. Third thing is broad and deep overhangs and shading devices. Fourth, light-colored materials. These seem pretty common sense, right? Fifth being proper building orientation. I mean, most people, do you know that our prevailing breezes in South Florida come from the southeast? And if you're not orienting buildings and openings to those types of orientation, then you're not actually breeze harvesting or collecting or maximizing the efficiency of our buildings. And so, go to the next slide. These are just some of those passive ventilation strategies. You have cross ventilation and convective ventilation, stack ventilation strategies. And those are pretty no-brainer things. These are things you can just look up online and find in an instance. But for some reason, we have lacked or have the inability to design for this. And I can tell you, this is what was so troubling to me and why I wrote the letter is that everybody I saw, how many of you use that Nextdoor app? I think we all saw it during Hurricane Irma. I was just kind of frustrated and just annoyed that everybody was like, when's the power going to come back on? Where's FP&L? Where are all these FP&L trucks? And I live in a 1955 mid-century modern spec house. And all I had to do was open my doors and windows. And I collected the cross breeze ventilation. I mean, it wasn't cold, but it was cool. It was comfortable. And I think we just need to understand that we live in a context that we need to adapt to the climate. We need to be able to work with what we have, and especially when the power's not off, we have to understand that there is a power and passive design strategies. And so as an architect, I think this is, you don't necessarily need an architect. Again, our grandparents just knew these things, but these are design solutions that I think would better serve us regionally to be thinking about this. But just simple things like stack ventilation where it just works off the premise of temperature differentials. Hot air rises, right? You know, it's cool air. If you let in cool air from the bottom and you stack ventilate that, you'll get airflow through a building. Cross ventilation works from a premise of just having air movement move it through with proper orientation and proper openings into that architecture. And so the last slide, I'll just, actually I don't know if it's the last slide. Yeah, the last slide. So vernacular architecture actually equals resilient architecture. And so, you know, sheltering in place, I think that's one thing, but what we need to talk about is that longer recovery effort. And I think architecture that serves its context, its climate, will actually serve us better. And so, again, I think the thesis here would be, how do we embed these things into the DNA of how we design, how our culture kind of moves forward, and thinking about those longer recovery efforts. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And we have lots of time for questions. So I have one. I actually have one for each of you, but so Jeff, I'll start with you. So 1950s sounds great, but my house was built in the 2000s. And so how do you go about retrofitting this? Because I have non-operable windows, right? I have thousands of windows, but none of them open. And so there is no cross ventilation. I have a window in my bathroom, and the next nearest window that opens is the storm door that's across the house outside my kitchen.
Yeah, hire an architect.
Hire an architect.
Well, real quick, I mean, Jim, it's pretty funny because similarly, the School of Architecture has no operable windows in downtown. And so this was a challenge even for our students when Hurricane Irma came through. 8 days of no power. I mean, our buildings essentially shut down. You can't occupy it because it just gets too hot. And so, you know, these are challenges that we all have to think, but there is ways to retrofit it. And this is what makes it so difficult, is your house is going to be a unique solution. If it's a spec home, those usually have pattern that we can actually specify how they can be rehabbed or retrofitted to allow for some of these strategies to be implemented into them. But there is a way, you know, there is definitely a way. Well, it's funny you ask that because my main research is in green infrastructure and thinking about these exact things. But, you know, I wanted to kind of focus on the architecture today, but even those can be. I mean, some of the modeling efforts that we're coming across, which actually has some data associated with it, shows like an acre of mangrove forest can actually evapotranspirate up to 100,000 gallons of water in an hour. Things like that are tremendous amounts of water can be dealt with, cleaned, storm surges can be managed. It's pretty tremendous what nature can actually do if we let nature actually participate in that. And I think that's something that we have to think about in the future. And what I'm kind of interested in is this new form of ecology called reconciliation ecology, which says we don't have enough conservation or land preservation or preserved currently right now to provide the ecological services to basically offset the deleterious effects of both our urban environments, but also to survive long-term storm events and other things. And so, I mean, these are issues that we need to really think about. And that's the thing. There's no silver bullet here. I mean, I'm talking about architectural strategies, but we also need to talk about urban strategies, and we also need to talk about infrastructural strategies. And I think those really lend into allowing nature to do more of the work for us.
Great. Yes.
You had mentioned that the Florida legislature mandates that nursing homes provide evacuation plans or have some kind of contingency. Is that something that's mandated currently, or is it something that's going to be or could be coming down? And if so, do you know anything about the specifications of those evacuation plans and what you might entail?
So, like I think it was mentioned earlier, Florida is extremely weak when it comes to any type of statutory force behind what is required of nursing homes, ALFs, any type of senior living facility. Right now, there are requirements, although we are not able to access them. There are requirements in place that are statutory requirements that dictate nursing homes must have certain plans in place, contingency plans, reciprocity plans with nursing homes within a certain proximity. However, those are being looked at currently. The current statute is being looked at by the legislative body right now, and they're looking to increase the mandates in terms of what it would look like, make it available for the public, to get public input, to get input from utility companies, nursing home providers, home health care providers, doctors, anybody that's involved. So they're trying to expand it by looking at it and reviewing what was in place back in 1992.
I'd just like to kind of carry off of that because I have been in that business for many years, and actually the nursing homes in Florida, if we're weak, that's scary because there's more compliance and oversight than in the nuclear regulatory industry here in Florida. We have county oversight, local municipality oversight. The problem is that I see that comprehensive emergency management plan that has been for over 27 years now mandated by every county for every nursing home, it still comes down to the executive director at that level of that facility pulling the trigger. And what we saw here is reciprocity went right out the window because the entire state of Florida was inundated. So there's no way that a community on the West Coast could evacuate to the East Coast or vice versa. It just wasn't happening. And what we saw is that those at the bottom, once again, because of evacuation, had to make a determination. Do I put my 50 or 60 people on a bus and kill 2 of them, or shelter in place and hope we survive? Because it's a fact that when you evacuate an elderly population, you create those issues. But my question was, is there going to be a point where we know that nursing homes are going to keep lobbying, against more compliance because of the cost to drive down top and pops. But is there going to be a point where the governor appoints someone at the ARPA level to make those decisions for the nursing homes and mandate evacuation in a given area?
So the long and short of my answer will be nobody knows right now. Like I said, the governor issued his emergency rule that is now in the hands of ACA, the Agency for Healthcare Administration, and the Department of Elder Affairs here in Florida. They're going through the formal rulemaking process, which can take about 5 to 6 months. They've been going for about a month now. They've already had one round of public input in Tallahassee. And so once the governor's emergency rule becomes codified in rule, that's most likely going to go parallel or somehow intertwine itself through what the legislative body is going to do. Now, the legislative session doesn't start till January 9th, and then it ends on March 8th. So we've got some time. Now, we have been going through the 9 committee weeks so far this fall, where this has been prevalent in the halls of the Capitol amongst many legislators, even in home districts and public speaking engagements. The legislative body is really seeking to address this. What that plan is going to look like, no one knows. But in giving an example of reciprocity and how it worked this time, but I think is a serious consideration, in my home county of Pinellas County, so St. Petersburg, there is an elder care facility that offers nursing home level of care and ALF level of care. They had reciprocity with a facility in Pensacola, Florida, so about a 9-hour drive from St. Petersburg, and they bused on school buses, because that's all that was available, their residents from the ALF, so assisted living facility. So not nursing home level of care patients, but still people with disabilities, with medical conditions. Fortunately, they got everybody to Pensacola safely, but this worked this one time. Had Tampa Bay received the impact that was anticipated at one point, I think across the board it would have been a heavy disaster. Flood zones, inadequacy of facilities. So when we talk about architecture, I think that's a perfect tie into what also the legislative body is investigating and looking at, but needs voices raised when it comes to the architectural aspect of this as well.
Yes. Okay.
I grew up in Chicago, and then I lived in New York for many years, so I've been through my share of severe blizzards and Hurricane Sandy, and I lived in older buildings and homes, and they got through it very well, so I hear you on that. But I think we also have to modernize our electrical grid. I was really surprised after Irma how
Yeah, that's probably beyond me a little bit to talk about the kind of electrical grid infrastructure, but I can tell you in all trajectories show in 50 years we're looking at a low energy future. You know, with that said, and I think we're looking at more decentralized infrastructure. You know, and going back to this Nextdoor app, it was pretty funny because a lot of the conversations that were happening was like, I'm going to go out and buy my photovoltaics next week after, you know, I get my power back. Because a lot of people were thinking about those things. You know, and so we're going to have some big challenges in South Florida just with sea level rise. I mean, because I've heard a lot of people make the case for why aren't we burying these lines? I mean, there's a lot more cost associated with that, especially when you think that our groundwater tables are so high. You're essentially having to create some sort of waterproof trench for these utilities to go into. And so these are all going to be unique challenges. I mean, and you know, again, you know, it's probably a little bit beyond me, but I can just say, you know, these are obviously things people are thinking about, and I think those two first things that I started with is that we're going to be looking at decentralizing, you know, for sure, and I think, you know, it's going to be a lower energy future. So how would design strategies in urbanism be rethought of in unique and quite elegant ways? I think, you know, I don't think these are nails in our coffin. I'm an optimist. I always think that there is a way to figure it out and that we can still solve for a lifestyle that, you know, is still relatively high.
I can piggyback on that. One thing that this is my bread and butter is utilities, and I do all of AARP Florida's utility works related to the Public Service Commission, the investor-owned utilities, and others. And so what you're talking about is hardening the grid, the storm hardening. And so there's multiple aspects of storm hardening that take place, all the way from power poles, literally putting up concrete poles as opposed to wooden poles that can withstand certain hurricane winds, to underground lines that in some areas work, other areas they don't. I mean, they can make it through a swamp, but sometimes can't make it through the substrate of a coastal area. One thing that we all have in common here in Florida, especially South Florida, is if you are a customer of one of the 5 investor-owned utilities, so FPL over here, 10 million customers statewide, Duke Energy, Tampa Electric, Gulf Power, or the Florida utilities, we don't have an option to shop around. So we have to take from our utility providers what they're giving us. And one thing that we all have in common, whether you be on the Tampa Bay side where I am or over here, is that we all pay monthly on our bill a fee that goes towards storm hardening. And in light of hurricanes, we also pay for the recovery. We see that in storm cost recovery cases that go before the Public Service Commission. Currently, FP&L customers, and I'm one of them, is paying for Hurricane Matthew from last year. And FPL, once again, has asked for $1.3 billion to cover the cost for Hurricane Irma recovery. And so as a customer and as a resident of Florida, we do have the ability to say, where is this money going? How is it being spent towards storm hardening? And I think these are very valid questions. Now, on the legislative side of things, legislators are looking at storm hardening and what can we do to improve the grid. Everything from tree trimming, like how is the tree trimming happening around the stations, substations, transformers, electrical lines, to what are the utility companies themselves out doing on a daily basis, monthly basis, weed control, anything that might impact power service. So these are all very valid questions and something that is being looked at multiple levels.
So I have a question for Lauree since she hasn't gotten one. So what would be best practices for non-canine pets, right? So you talked about all shelters should take all pets, right? But so person has a dog, a person has a cat. I happen to have a Queen of Bavaria conure, right? Which is like a feathered dog that plays fetch with me, okay, and lives for 70 years. So so best practices, how do we do that for non-canines?
I mean, shelters that are going to give shelter to people, it needs to be mandatory that domestic pets, such as your bird, cat, dogs, be allowed, and they allow an area in that shelter where they all need to have an area and not exclude that 1 out of 3 will take domestic pets. And the other thing that is, needs to be changed here in the state of Florida, only 10% of the hotels in the state of Florida are pet friendly. So even if somebody doesn't have they feel their home's not going to be safe, they're in a low-lying area, they're in an area that's not safe to stay during a hurricane, even tries to go to a hotel, be it Florida, Georgia, wherever they're evacuating to, they can't take their pets. So laws need to be changed. People need to be more prepared. We do as a state to protect the animals during these hurricanes because many people, even though they're gonna flood, they know they're putting themselves in harm's way. If they don't have a place to take their animal, they will stay behind. And I can tell you that 90% of the people that do stay behind, that they suffer, their animals suffer, and you see a lot of evacuees, people that are evacuating these, paramedics, police, all of them, they're having to put themselves in harm's way to go get them out because they stayed behind with their pet.
I want to thank the panel for a really wonderful session. We have a coffee break, and everybody's going to be available during the coffee break, both the first panel and the second panel. But I think everybody could really use. Again, thank you for your participation.